Everybody that's online, this is Aaron Monaco with CAT Management. Incredibly excited to have David Graf and Tim Moeller with us from Moeller Graf. Some of the best representatives of HOA law representation here in Colorado. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very much.
Having us. David Graf, Tim Moeller. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Aaron.
All we do is represent communities. That's all we've done for about coming up on 20 years now. And we're thrilled to be here to speak with you, supporting a great management company run by very decent people. And I don't say that about everyone, but there's a level of care here that we don't see throughout the industry. So we're honored to be here. This is going to be a little bit of a, not a hodgepodge. We're going to talk about the history of associations very briefly, not a history lesson. We want it to be relevant to you. And then we'll talk about roles in the community and the governing documents. Part of the problem with trying to teach this stuff is that if there's not a framework where we can give this information to you, where you can retrieve it, it's just a lot of facts. And hopefully we'll talk about this in a way that makes it easier for you to remember, so that when you're under duress at a special assessment meeting for insurance premiums, you have a better understanding of where to find these document provisions and how they interrelate. So in the beginning, right, we expanded from the East Coast, and I'm from the East Coast originally, to the West Coast. And the idea was to grab as much land as you could. And if you bought land, it may or may not have a structure on it. And that wasn't really as important as just owning the land itself. And historically, real property law in Colorado and in many states, most states in America, was if you bought the land, you could do whatever you wanted to with that land, and no one could tell you to stop doing that on your private property. And so, historically, we had buildings, and then we had people starting to come here in greater numbers. And so again, you might have a homestead with land around it to support you for farming or for grazing. And then there was a pig farm. Not any one pig farm, not like Mrs. Smith's pig farm that became a case at the U.S. Supreme Court level in the 1700s. But the idea is that people were doing things on their property that went off of the boundaries of their property and affected their neighbors. And historically, they could do that. And if you moved next to a pig farm, or your neighbor wanted to have a pig farm, then you just had to put up with it. But over time, we started putting more and more people on smaller and smaller lots, and it was no longer tenable to have the pig farm come in and affect the livability of all of the people in this community. And that was the law of nuisance, and that still exists today. And it's probably once a year I get asked a question, can we declare this individual a nuisance? It's not really being annoying. It's not at all being annoying. And a legal nuisance is doing something on your property that causes things, smoke, light, heat, vibration, smells. We've fought flies, bees, rodents, smells, dust, anything that travels across property boundaries. And if the neighbor's use of it is materially diminished, then that would be a nuisance, and the law would step in and say you can't continue to do that. And about 10 years ago, there was the most famous nuisance case that happened in my lifetime, was the Sriracha factory nuisance case, where they were making their Sriracha hot sauce in California and roasting their red peppers. And people were walking around in town with itchy eyes. And the city said, hey, that's a nuisance, you have to stop doing that. And that law still exists separately from covenants. But why do we have covenants in the first place? Well, it's to agree on how we're going to use property that might affect our neighbors, where it may not rise to the level of a legal nuisance, so that people have less uncertainty in what's going to happen on the property next to theirs in their community. So that's kind of the historical treatment. Was the law of nuisance didn't give people adequate assurances that their neighbor wouldn't start pig farming after they bought their home. So they recorded covenants where people agreed by virtue of buying property that they would not start a pig farm. Now in Colorado and nationally, there are only 3 different types of communities. And the cooperative is easy for Colorado because it's less than 1% of the housing in Colorado, although it's big in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Florida. And you sometimes see cooperative stories on the news because to buy into a cooperative, you might have to audition before your co-op board, and they might not let you buy in, which is a whole other issue. But in Colorado, other than a few cooperatives, and there's been a few new ones built primarily in El Paso County, and I think they're on the rise. I'm not sure why, but here we have planned communities and condos. And there's a reason why you might want to know the difference, although they don't always look the same. A planned community is a single-family home community. Oh, didn't switch. Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're good.
Oh, thank you. And it's characterized where if there are common elements like green spaces or a clubhouse, it's owned by the HOA corporation. Now, what we call it doesn't really matter. If the owner owns dirt below their home and the bricks and sticks of their home, it doesn't matter who maintains or insures it. It's a planned community. And that can be attached townhouses, detached townhouses, patio homes, single-family home communities. It doesn't make any difference what we call it. And this would be kind of a classic row townhouse type of community. It's a planned community. I wish I had been smart enough to invent the condominium. Okay, because if you think about it, if you have to own the dirt below your home, well, earth is finite, right? We talk about, nothing, no matter is never created or lost. Over time, if everyone owns their dirt, we run out of dirt. And the condominium, instead of owning the dirt, it's an interest in real estate that had to be accepted by state law, where you could say, I own an interest in property, and it's not touching the dirt. So this could be, in Florida, it could either be a cooperative or a condominium, but every one of those units on all of those individual floors are legally real estate without owning the dirt. Brilliant idea, and that's how we can have more people living together on smaller and smaller lots. So I already said the condo is very rare. When does it matter? Well, it matters when we're trying to sort out who maintains what, who insures what, but oftentimes we want to know what the owner owns, because whatever the owner doesn't own, usually the association owns. And again, ownership is not automatically tied to who has to insure it or who has to maintain it, but it's good to know what the owner owns, because if the owner owns the dirt beneath their unit, they might have a responsibility for the sewer lines beneath their unit. Whereas if it was a condo, when that sewer line goes outside the boundaries of the unit, which would usually be at the top of the unfinished flooring, that might be a common element that the association would have to maintain. So knowing these unit boundaries is super helpful, and the first place to start is, what do we have legally in terms of planned community or condo? And then there's, oh, go ahead.
You can't always tell just by looking at them, right? So you look at some and they look like townhouses, and you think, well, that's a townhouse. But when you look at their governing documents, you'll see the ownership interest is the airspace, and it's really a condominium, even if they are touching the dirt. We even have some that look like single-family homes that are condominiums.
Which is a little interesting. And again, maintenance responsibilities doesn't necessarily have to track with ownership. And so in townhouses, as an example, which are legally single-family home communities, the association may have the obligation to maintain the roofs and the siding, the grounds. They might have an obligation to insure the exteriors of the building. And for those of you in condominiums, maybe not so much down here in Denver, downtown proper, but the hinterlands, any other county outside of Denver where we have, huge townhouse communities where the association has to insure the roofs and the siding, the insurance premiums have gone astronomically ridiculous. And they have for condos too, but maybe not quite the same for townhouses. And some of our townhouse communities are saying, geez, can we really stay in the business of insuring these townhouses? Because the insurance is so ridiculously expensive. So that's why we want to know, do we have a townhouse community or do we have a condominium? Anyone ever heard of Kiowa? Yes, it is a town. I think it's a county as well, but it's also the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. It's a series of laws that has been amended. It's been patched more times than my old blue jeans. Every year it seems like the legislature wants to get under the hood and amend Kiowa. It took effect on July 1 of 1992, and it was designed at the time to strengthen and promote community living as a way of serving the interests of the homeowners who lived in those communities. Fast forward to 2005, the veterans in the room SB 100. It was the Homeowner Protection Act of 2005. Now we had to have a law to protect homeowners from their HOA. Kiowa matters. It's split, it used to be split down the middle between applying in its entirety to communities created after this date and have limited applicability to communities in existence as of that effective date. Almost every change to Kiowa, everyone that I can think of since 2005, has applied to both pre-1992 communities and post-1992 communities. It's important to know, number one, it's important to know that it exists, and it's good that you have professional management so that you don't have to go to the boring classes taught by the lawyers about what's new in Kiowa this year, because it is changing every year. But it does contain mandatory provisions that will override certain provisions of your governing documents in some cases, and in other cases not. And so when the manager says, no, you can't do that because of Kiowa, they're giving you good advice. There's also the Nonprofit Act. We have one HOA out of probably 700 that is a for-profit corporation because they sell hay, literally hay. They make money with hay. Most of our associations are nonprofit corporations, and because of that, the corporate code known as the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act applies, and it usually contains more default rules for how your community operates if the idiotic lawyer that wrote the governing documents forgot to mention what quorum might be for your annual meeting. So let's get into the documents. First document, and I'm going to go ABCs, Articles of Incorporation, Bylaws, and Covenants. Just easy to remember. And this is not a hierarchical list, it's alphabetical. Articles of Incorporation in their purest form just create a corporation. That's it. And a corporation generally is just a bunch of people doing business in a name other than themselves. Okay? File with the Secretary of State, which is a state agency that also oversees elections, if you're watching the news. Pretty minor. Sometimes, though, the Articles of Incorporation might say how many people have to be on the board. They might limit the number of things that the board can do, like borrowing money or something like that. So it's nice to know what the Articles of Incorporation might say, although we don't look at them very often because they're not all that substantive in the most part. The bylaws. My mother lives in a condo in Connecticut, and she says, the bylaws say that the skylights have to be maintained. No, the bylaws don't say that. The bylaws are just the private, unrecorded, usually, rules of how the corporation runs. Now, they can be recorded in the land records, but most of the time they are not. Now, go ahead.
Just no, leave it.
Okay, you don't need to transfer, I got another microphone. So.
Just going back to the articles, the only other thing of any importance in the articles, really, I mean, sometimes you'll see those substantive things like David said, but the only other thing that the law says you can put in there is a limitation of liability for the board of directors. So usually, in most of your articles of incorporation, you'll find that. If you look through it, it'll have some sort of a limitation of liability, which the law says you can put in there. So.
Thank you. Yeah, good point. So some of the things that we worry about in the bylaws is taking action at the board level outside of a meeting. The Nonprofit Act was changed probably, 8 years ago to allow for board member email voting with less than unanimous consent. But a lot of the bylaws that were written prior to that change in the Nonprofit Act were written to say that the board can take action outside of a meeting with unanimous consent. And so our take would be that you could still do an email vote, but you might have to have unanimous consent. And so the point is to say that your documents are changing, the law is changing, and it's important to know what both of them say so that we can then determine which one controls. Sometimes the bylaws have a limitation on spending, borrowing. Sometimes they have weird or clumsy alternative dispute resolution procedures. State law already requires that you have to have a policy on alternative dispute resolution. So why anybody would put it in the bylaws is beyond me, but sometimes we see it in there.
One other thing for the bylaws. Most of them are behind the times. Like David said, some of them say you have to get a unanimous vote to do it by email. Amend that out, if you can. It's not that expensive. It's worth it so that the board can function without having everything at a meeting so that you can take care of emergencies and things like that. The other thing that they're way behind on in the law and is electronic voting, right? You rarely see bylaws that have anything about electronic voting. They all assume that you're all going to get together and you're going to and that ship has kind of sailed. And so we've been doing a lot of amendments pertaining to electronic voting as well. So if your bylaws are antiquated, which most are, you may want to think about those types of things to make it easier, because it's the blueprint of how you're running your community. Make it as easy as possible for you to run your community and get your job done.
And sometimes we see that the bylaws have all kinds of extraneous stuff not related to the corporate functions in them. Why is that? Because it's easier to amend the bylaws than the declaration. And previous boards, to my eternal frustration, may have tried to sneak something in that should have been in the declaration into the bylaws, and so we're flipping back and forth. The law is that the declaration controls over the bylaws, but if your bylaws look like this, it's probably because they found that was the easiest way to put in what they wanted without getting a 2/3 owner vote to amend the declaration. So I said ABCs and I switched to D, and I do know how to count. Well, actually I don't know how to count, but I do know how to go through my ABCs. Covenants and declaration are synonymous. Covenant, usually the formal term would be either the condominium declaration or the declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. This is the most important document because what it is a document that's recorded in the land records that says, I as an owner who purchased in this community agree to do certain things like pay assessments, and I agree not to do certain things like start pig farming in my backyard. And it's a change in real estate, which is kind of dramatic in the law. It's not as dramatic now as it was 40 years ago, but when we're giving away or bargaining away our ownership rights of private property, it's a big deal. And the law holds this document as the highest, arguably, document, and it's recorded in the clerk and recorder's office, which is different than the Secretary of State. This is what every clerk and recorder looks like in every state in America. Very diligent people. So when we look at the declaration, oftentimes it will say what the definition of a unit is. Like a condo might say, the unit boundaries is the unfinished surfaces of the walls, floors, and ceilings. Okay, that suggests that there's an airspace that the owner owns. Sometimes it may say it's the boundary of the lot as set forth on the plat. That's super helpful to know what the boundaries of the unit are. Sometimes we have to go to the plat or map. And the plat or map, which I don't have a slide for, are other documents that Kiowa defines as equally weighty as the declaration. And a plat is when a developer wants to buy 50 acres, let's say, and sell 50 one-acre home sites. The law requires them to record a document that breaks up that 50 acres into separate legal descriptions. That's what a plat is. A map is a three-dimensional breakup of the ownership of the real estate so that you can sell individual condominium units that exist in the air. And so sometimes when we don't know who maintains ductwork or a fan coil unit that heats and cools the unit, we have to look at the declaration and the map to try to figure out, is that in the common area, meaning outside the boundaries of the unit, or is it inside the boundaries of the unit? Oh, budget process and special assessment authority. I won't go into it because you have professional management. Just know there is no individual authority for special assessments in the law. And so if your question is, can we do a special assessment, then you look at your governing documents, and if it doesn't say anything about special assessments, then you might still be able to do one, but you would follow the budget ratification process that exists in your declaration. Not all, a number of our clients are stressing about budgets and insurance premiums and deductibles, and so this issue has come up a lot lately. Back to the clerk and recorder, I'm going in the wrong direction. Sometimes there's committees. Some committees very rarely are independently elected by the homeowners. 99.9% of the time, the committee members are appointed by the board and serve at the pleasure of the board. And I know that sounds egotistical, but the idea is that the committee members are there to help the board, not to become a separate board governing the community without any controls. Go ahead.
When you're dealing with the committees, some of them get a life of their own, if you've ever dealt with that, right? Next thing you know, they've all got badges and they're, got matching aprons or whatever it is, and they're talking to your vendors and stuff. So sometimes it's a good idea. Their committees are great because they can do a lot of, they get into the committee because they're interested in it, right? So they do a lot of the footwork. But it's a good idea sometimes to have a charter saying, here's what we want you to do, here's what we don't want you to do. And by the way, we can dissolve this committee anytime we want, or we can change it up and things like that, because sometimes when they get on there, they determine that that's their lot in life, and if you try to remove them, then it gets ugly sometimes. So not a bad idea to have a charter. Pretty simple thing. You don't necessarily need a lawyer or anything. It's not a legal document. It just kind of says, hey, this is why we created it. Here's what we want you to do. Here's kind of what we don't want you to do. And by the way, we can change this or remove it anytime. So just
Yeah, the committee charter is
Little
great. And it also usually would address spending authority or the lack of spending authority, and sometimes that's where we get in trouble. If you have volunteers serving off of the board, but they're still serving the community, it's nice generally to document their service by the appointment of a committee, because that's more likely to have them covered under the directors and officers insurance. If you have a number of people helping the association and they're not formalized, then they might not be protected by the association's insurance. And sometimes that would be helpful to say in the committee charter and to identify the members so that there's no question that they're serving on behalf of the association. Because you might be surprised, there are people who aren't on the board, but they want to make decisions as if they are on the board. And it's nice to have clarity as to who is and who's not in leading this. The declaration will also contain insurance provisions, usually who insures what. In a condominium, it's relatively straightforward. In a townhouse community, it varies by what the declaration says. And often the declaration will contain use restrictions. And Kiowa says for any community created after 1992, the declaration must contain use restrictions. What are use restrictions on the use of private property? We don't really know. We know that if you said you can't use your home for a home-based business, that would be a use restriction, although Kiowa has overruled that and allowed home-based businesses. If you said you can't smoke in your unit, not just not smoking to the point where it doesn't annoy your neighbors, but no smoking at all, meaning a smoke-free building, that's probably a use restriction. If you wanted to say you can't ride your llamas in the common areas, that might or might not be a use restriction. Why is that? Because a use restriction tells an owner that they can't do something inside their home even if there's no impact outside the home. Whereas rules will typically govern the common elements, or they will govern how people use their units for the protection of other unit owners. And the law is startlingly unclear, not just in Colorado on this topic, but nationally.
And there's a lot of, not a lot, there are some boards that it's easier to make a rule, because the board can do that unilaterally, than to amend your declaration, which requires probably 67% of everyone to vote.
No, I'm just kidding.
So, you have to be careful that use restrictions aren't being created in your rules.
So here's how we turn, yes, coming up on that, because the declaration under state law cannot be amended by less than a majority of all of the owners. Not just a majority who show up at a meeting, but a majority of all of the interests. In many cases, it's 67%, and in some rare cases, it's whatever higher number the declaration specifies.
So no smoking has to be in the deck.
I think it does, and especially for post-92 communities, because the contents of the declaration section of Kiowa says use restrictions must be in the declaration. And you could try it by rule, but you'd be playing with fire. And because there's always...
You'd have a hard time.
Well, the people, believe it or not, the people who smoke in their units don't want to stop smoking in their units. And the last thing we want to do is to get in front of a judge if we can help it and lose because we cut a corner. Now, rules are super duper helpful because the declaration is supposed to be like a constitution. It's not supposed to be amended willy-nilly, which is not a legal term. But if it's not supposed to be amended so readily, how does an association board keep pace with the changing times? Well, you do it by rules, and you can fill in the gaps of governing, especially common area and sometimes among units, by rules. Didn't know I had this picture, did you? No. Because 20 years ago, they might say you can't skateboard in the pool, and Razor scooters were not invented. That's not really that looks like a 40-year-old scooter. But the idea would be that if the declaration said X, Y, and Z, we might have the ability to elaborate that in a rule. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. Rules are not recorded we don't make them an exhibit to the declaration. And there's a couple lawyers out there that make them an exhibit to the declaration, which is weird because then it begs the question, do you have to amend the declaration to change your rules? And you don't want to do that. The board usually changes the rules by board vote, not by owner vote. So what are the rules on rules? Well, generally, you can add a criteria that doesn't rise to a use restriction if the declaration doesn't touch upon that issue. And I'll give examples of each of these. You may clarify an ambiguous provision. Oh, go ahead. Question.
Are the rules the same thing as bylaws?
No. Articles create the corporation. Bylaws, how to run the corporation. Declaration, use restrictions, paying assessments. And the rules are a fourth category of documents that are separate from the bylaws. The bylaws contain rules, technically speaking, but they're really rules on how to govern the corporation. And these rules might be architectural criteria, they might be pool rules, they might be pet rules, they may be move-in, move-out rules that unless your declaration said otherwise, those would be a board decision to adopt. Does that make sense? So it's the four categories: article, ABCs, and rules. Go ahead. You have a question at the tip of your tongue.
The 11th book that was given to me was on the board of bylaws. I know I have rules. I have to go look and see if they're the same packet.
So the question was for the people listening, I'm on the board, I got this 8-page series, 8-inch thick, I'm exaggerating, but I got this huge book. There's bylaws, there may be rules, there's guidelines, there's responsible governance policies. They're probably all different titles. So for me, it's like, okay, are they part of the Articles of Incorporation? If they're not with the Secretary of State, they're not. Are they part of the bylaws? If it doesn't say amendment to the bylaws, they're not bylaws. If they're not an amendment to the declaration that's recorded in the Clerk and Recorder's Office, they're not part of your declaration. Everything else, no matter what it's called, is a rule. Responsible governance policies was a name the state created out of thin air in 2005 to say you need 9 responsible governance policies. They're rules. But they don't use that because you have to be responsible. So forget the names. Usually they'll say if it's a resolution, oftentimes the board will call it a resolution if it governs board business. Let's do a resolution that will change the time of our meeting from 6:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. And if it's a rule, often it's setting policy for people beyond the board, but that's not set forth in law, that's just what they decided to call it. So don't sweat the numbers or the details. If it's not an article, bylaw, or covenant, it's a rule. And they're all equal in terms of their hierarchy as rules. Rules are all the same. So let's take a couple, and there are some limitations on rulemaking authority, which I already talked about, which is you can't adopt a use restriction on private property by rule. But if you said no razor scooters in the pool, that to me is not a use restriction on private property. So let's say the declaration doesn't mention smoking. No, that's kind of hard. Let's say the declaration doesn't mention anything about pool rules, and the pool is part of our common area. The board could adopt a rule saying you got to wear a swimsuit, you can't have glass at the pool. Those are just general rules because the declaration doesn't touch on it. No dogs. Well, we fight the no dogs at the pool with the emotional support. In the pool? Oh yeah. We've had multiple cases with people wanting to bring their emotional support dog into the pool. And they get a doctor, I use that term loosely, to say, yeah, you need to have the dog in the pool. You have to. I'm like, okay. Well, I'm not going to say anything too politically incorrect on this, but sometimes the declaration says something, and the question is, it doesn't say enough for us to make meaning out of it. Can we fix that ambiguity by a rule? Classic cases, the declaration may say no commercial vehicles in the common area, but they don't define what a commercial vehicle is. Let me tell you, by the time you sell enough Mary Kay to have the pink Cadillac, you can fight your HOA as to whether that's a commercial vehicle. I know that from experience. Be careful. But you might say a commercial vehicle is this. Ladder racks, signage, truck body of whatever over a certain weight. You could, by rule, clarify what commercial vehicle is. However, true story, I'm trying to think of I'm going to make up, it's not exactly true, but it's equally outlandish. The declaration says no boxcars, hovercraft, hydroplanes, boats, or commercial vehicles. And someone wants to put a caboose, which may not be a boxcar, on their property.
Caboose.
Yeah,
Train caboose.
train caboose. Oh yeah, full size, big. So here's the thing to think about. Yes, the declaration does not say no boxcars, but when the declaration contains a laundry list of things, hydroplanes, boxcars, hydrofoils, boats, and it doesn't say or other similar things, the law would presume that that list of no's was exhaustive, meaning you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, so everything else is permitted. So that's why they say, or other things as may be prohibited by rule. And if it doesn't say that, we have to be careful in adopting a rule that tacks on more no's when the declaration had a list of no's. And there's a Latin phrase for it. Was it justum generis, or is it, it's expressio unis exclusive.
Yes, yeah.
Basically, if you say something and permit it, then you exclude everything else by inference. So just be careful on your rulemaking authority.
Another example that we see that's probably more prolific downtown is leasing restrictions.
Short term.
You might have something in your documents that say, hey, you can lease, but you have to provide us a copy of your lease and things like that. And it's very tempting for boards to say, you know what, we're going to add a rule that says you can't lease for more than a month, so that they,
Or less
than a month, excuse me. Thanks, David. To prohibit the short-term leasing. That is a use restriction. And that needs to go in an amendment to your declaration if you're going to do that. Don't try to do that by rule, but that's a tempting one. Saying, it's not necessarily covered in our declaration, so we'll just create a rule. And we've seen that happen, and I don't think that one ends well.
Or it might say, or we might adopt a rule saying, we want to approve your leases. I don't love that idea. I don't want to get in between the owner and their tenant, because then when the tenant doesn't pay the rent, they're going to say, well, that was your lease that you approved. For me, if we're going to try to restrict rentals, it's much better to do it through a declaration amendment, even though the vote is hard. If you do it by rule, you're on thin ice, and that's being very generous, so be careful. So let's talk briefly about roles. Owners elect directors, amend the declaration, they vote to terminate the community. Depending on when your community was created, they might have the right or the duty to veto the budget or to approve an increase in assessments. That's it. There's a few other things. Anything that might be reserved to them in the law or in the governing documents would be an owner vote. But generally, it's very limited, right? The idea is that the owners gather every year. They elect their victims, volunteers who are willing to do their work for free. And then the law supports the board having broad authority to run the corporation. Now, I think the board should have more authority to set budget levels, but I'm not in the legislature, because this tension of having reserve funds versus owners not wanting to pay increased assessments is a problem for many of our clients. It's like, hey, we need to have more money in reserves, but the pressure to keep assessments at a what is perceived a reasonable rate is enormous. We get that, and it's tough. So, but again, owners don't do a heck of a lot. Board does everything else that is not reserved to the owners in the governing documents or in the law. And when we say subject to transparency laws, we're meaning, process, open meetings. And this may be another conversation, but the best thing that a board can do is to make as many decisions as they can in an open meeting and delegate action items and follow up to its professional management team, and then try to do nothing. And I recognize that some high-rises are like vertical cruise ships where every day something's going on, but to the extent that you can do as much as you can in open meetings and then leave that board meeting room and take your board hat off and go back to being a private citizen. Because when you do stuff by email and you have to have emergency meetings and it's a daily thing, it becomes a burden on the volunteers to serve. And quite frankly, it's a better corporate practice to do things in open meetings and then declare yourself a private citizen. And when you have professional management, you have the luxury of actually making that a reality. It's not supposed to be a part-time job. It's not supposed to be an additional full-time job. And all it does is create liability the more things that are done in between regular open board meetings. Anybody disagree?
Not at all.
It's the gift you need to give yourself as a volunteer. Okay, so committees, it depends on what their role are. Usually it's whatever the board decides through the charter that Tim mentioned. And then professional management. Managers are not currently regulated. Are they going to be regulated? Probably, because the legislature can't keep their hands off the industry. I don't know if it's going to come back. The bill failed last year, closely failed as I recall. I think it's likely to happen. Does it matter? I think there are good things and bad things for managers being licensed. From our perspective, and I train managers who are trying to get their manager license for the entire time that the law was in effect, and the reality is the good management companies have always been so far above the minimal licensure requirements that it's scary. So licensure, I think, elevated the profession. It gave homeowners who didn't like the no that they got from their board to turn in the management company. It's a mixed bag as to whether it's a good thing. Just know that it's not the law today. The duty that the management company owes to your HOA is set forth in the management company contract. I got 1 minute left. You got anything on any topic other than as long as it's HOA related? Yes.
In the previous slide, you said,
I take it back.
terminate community. I think that was,
Yeah, terminate the community. Here it is.
what exactly was
That, oh, so the question is, I said, there was a slide that said the homeowners would vote to terminate the community. That's where, as an example, the community was at the end of its useful functioning life. And the homeowner said, you know what, it's going to cost us I'm making up numbers, $82 million to rehabilitate this so that we can maintain it for $1 million condos, or we can sell it for $42 million and make the money and walk away into the sunset. The homeowners vote that the community is obsolete. There's a process in Kiowa. It is sold, presumably for the value of the land. The building might be, not in every case, demolished and redeveloped. We're seeing it, we don't practice outside of Colorado, but it's happening in San Francisco, it's happening in Denver, it's happening anywhere across the Florida coast, where the value of the land for development is worth more than the cumulative value of the units for residential purposes when you tack on what it costs to make them habitable.
We did this one time, CAPAS, one single time for a property by Sloan's Lake that had just deteriorated. 24 units, there were 3 owners that lived in the community. I think you can imagine what a property would be like if there wasn't a large owner representation there, because there's no way around the fact that owners are going to take care of the property much better than renters. Chris planted trees, they cut the trees down. People took the fence and sold it for parts. They took their cars and drove them right up to the front. I came there one time and there's a car sitting in front of one of the buildings. Like, we couldn't stop it. It was insane. They had graffiti spray painted on the wall, $800 to remove it. They graffitied it the next day. I mean, it was just horrible. So, in a forward-thinking move on our part, which inhibited us a bit because we lost the association essentially, we found someone, developers who were interested. We went to the community. If you owed money, you got out from under. If you were kind of even, you got a little bit of money back. And if you owned your property outright, you got a nice check. And they flattened the whole place. It's at 17th and King. You'll drive by and see it. It's gorgeous now. And what was there was an arbor. One time I got an invitation from the community, from the Sloan's Lake community, to come to a meeting. Like, oh, cool, I'll go to this meeting. And I went to the meeting, and like the police were there, and the owners from the nearby communities, and they were all yelling at me. And I'm like, hold on, like, this isn't us. Like, we don't control what you know the renters there. Like, but you know, we were the face of it. So
it takes a lot of sophistication to handle. That is a 5-ring circus to handle, and most companies would not touch that with a 40-foot pole. Yeah. Wow.
It'll come back 10 years away, I think.
Oh yeah. Is it apartments now?
Condos.
Oh, it is condos.
Yeah, really.
That, but I mean this.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to a guy in Iowa. You know, they had these huge boom and bust cycles in the real estate market. And he's like, we just finished the last bust cycle where all of these communities were at the end of their useful life, and they had to be either radically overhauled with assessments and huge influx of money or terminated. And then the next boom bust cycle is going to happen. And we've had the same thing here in Colorado. And a lot of these condos, not a lot, but some of them are nearing their useful life, and it's going to be a good question
And
as
the
to.
land where they sit is beautiful.
Yep, that's right. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.